My name is Moises. I am here with Amy Stelly from the Claiborne Avenue Allaince, based in Treme. Very excited to do this interview with you, Amy. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
So to start it off, give us a description of what you do at the Claiborne Avenue Allaince and what got you into it, and
Okay.
basics.
Well, actually, the Claiborne Avenue Allaince is our advocacy arm. The Claiborne Avenue Allaince Design Studio is the nonprofit design studio that's actually working on the physical transformation of Claiborne. So our work is all encompassing. We got started down this particular road by partnering with LSU School of Public Health to look at the health impacts of living near an urban highway. And that has morphed into a bigger project. And now we're about to actually execute an EPA grant that actually monitors air quality. And we're going to create a picture of the community, a health-based picture of the community, and then make recommendations. But those recommendations will then be supported by economic data, traffic data, as well as the public health. So the science is the engine here, and the recommendations, the urban design recommendations, comes from other disciplines, because we know that everything is affected when highways go through neighborhoods, right? It's not only transportation, but it's also economic. There are social things that come along with it. So we want to paint this broad picture, or not broad, more accurate picture, because we have a broad picture of what happens when these things impact communities. And we want to create that picture and then make recommendations. Of course, I have to really be quite honest and say, we think removal of the Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans is the only way to mitigate all of the things that have happened to Treme and the 7th Ward neighborhood. So there's another neighborhood that was as badly impacted as Treme, and I think in many ways worse. And that is what media folks choose not to show. So my mission is to not only show what I call the poster child for the Claiborne Expressway, and we've all seen it, the superstructure with the arches. My husband calls it a cathedral of concrete. It's an ugly cathedral. But then when you get into the residential core of the 7th Ward, where they just ram the highway through, it's really foreboding. It's dark. The sound is dangerously high, or the noise level, the decibel level are dangerously high. And it's just not really a pretty picture back there. To answer your question about how I got into this work, I was born in the Claiborne Corridor, well, raised in the Claiborne Corridor. I was actually born in Uptown New Orleans, near beautiful St. Charles Avenue. That's how people know Uptown New Orleans. But my parents moved to the Claiborne Corridor when I was a year. And at that point, Claiborne was beautiful. It looked like St. Charles Avenue, for those who know pictures of New Orleans with the iconic streetcar. We didn't have the streetcar, but we certainly had the trees. We had the businesses. We had the beautiful housing stock, some of which is still standing, fortunately. But then in the 60s, the script flipped. The highway came through, and what my family invested in 70 years ago was no longer the same. So growing up in this corridor, I couldn't understand why it was so ugly to begin with, and now ugly and really horrible because it's getting worse. And I just decided that when I was an adult, I would take it down. So I'm fulfilling the promise that I made to myself as a child.
Wow. So, yeah. And I've seen pictures of the Claiborne Expressway. Like, it's an elevated highway. Mm-hmm. Houses are pretty much covered by it. You know, you go on a roof, you can pretty much touch it from the roof of some houses.
Yes.
Yeah, I can't believe, when you were young, you said, I'm going to take it down. That's inspiring.
Well, thank you. I was driven by the ugliness of it all.
Right. Yeah. It's not just the ugliness, it's other stuff too.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about the Claiborne Avenue Alliance's like mission and vision for Treme?
Yes. So the Alliance's mission for Treme is to actually transform Claiborne Avenue, which was beautiful, tree-lined. It has a 100-foot wide median, so it was actually like a really huge parkway that went down the middle of Claiborne. So our goal is to actually transform Claiborne by having the highway removed and the boulevard rebuilt, understanding that it's not going to look the same because we can't place century-old oak trees. But there are certainly things that we can do to have the boulevard sort of reclaim its beauty. The good news about Claiborne is that a lot of the historic building stock is still standing. We have a lot of vacancy. So, just counting that, we still have quite a few handsome structures, along with the famous St. Louis cemeteries that borders the highway too. So there's a lot of history on the avenue that is still there that needs to be, brought forward and elevated. And our mission is to actually do that. And also help the economics revive, because right now it's pretty woeful.
Yeah. So when you speak of reclaiming the beauty and, those beautiful oak trees that line the boulevard, what was Treme and the 7th Ward like before the Claiborne Expressway came through?
Well, Treme, actually there are two sections. So there's what I call the historic core, which is the original Treme neighborhood that was found in the early 1700s. And then there is my part of Treme, which was suburban at the time.
Right.
In the historic core, the buildings are very close together. There's 5 feet between buildings. I live in a huge 2-story house with a very wide lot. So it was really suburbia at its time, but now that's all considered Treme. So it has 2 very distinct sections known for jazz primarily.
Right.
We have a lot of jazz artists who live here. Trombone Shorty is probably the most famous contemporary artist, but one artist that people probably don't associate with New Orleans, and he's before my time, but I've heard of him, is Louis Prima. So back in the day, way back in the Wayback Machine, what I call the suburban part of Treme was primarily Sicilian. And then it eventually changed to Black.
Right.
So my family bought from Sicilians, a Sicilian family, and the Sicilian musicians lived on my side. So Louis Prima lived on my side of Claiborne. And then the Black and Creole primarily, musicians lived on the riverside, what we call. So that's the dynamic of Treme. So there's still a lot of music here. 7th Ward was known more for the craftsmen, the finished carpenters, the bricklayers, all of the trades. When you look at New Orleans architecture and you look at what makes it beautiful, those craftsmen primarily lived in the 7th Ward. So you had the building arts and then you had music. So both neighborhoods collectively fueled the creative class in New Orleans, which has been here since its inception.
Wow. And you mentioned, and by the way, when you say that, like, it was mostly Sicilian.
Yes.
We've seen that in other places. We've seen that in Rondo and Detroit, where these BIPOC communities, they used to be like immigrant communities before the Great Migration and all that. So that's awesome.
Right. Before we move on, I hate to interrupt you. I do want to let people know what I mean when I say Creole.
Oh, I was really about to ask you about that.
Okay, good.
What does Creole mean?
So actually, the Creole community in New Orleans is the community of the French colony.
Right.
Right. So the French settled New Orleans, and people who were of the colony were called Creole. So in downtown New Orleans, it's primarily descendants of the early Creoles. I live downtown. In uptown New Orleans, it's descendants of Americans. And the British actually are people from the United Kingdom. So my mom's grandfather was Welsh. So we have really distinct cultures, and you can see it as you go through the neighborhood. Now it's much more of a hodgepodge, but it was a lot more distinct at one time.
Okay. So Creoles pretty much people from France who colonized America?
Yeah, the French descendants who came in, but the French who came in and colonized America, right? And established Louisiana, the descendants of those settlers are the Creole people.
Okay.
So Creole isn't only Black.
Right.
It's of the French colony.
Oh, but it can be people of African descent also, right?
It's associated more now with people who are of African descent.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah. Good.
But okay. So moving on to the marketing or how we talk about these projects happening across the country, that's similar to Treme.
Yeah.
It's often mentioned in tandem with ReConnect Rondo.
Yes.
So in your eyes, what makes Rondo significant on a national scale?
Well, Rondo is significant for the work that has been done. So when I look at sort of the life of ReConnect Rondo, and I look at how the organizers have gone from one thing, like taking surveys, building relationships, you guys are a bit farther ahead than we are. So I look up to Rondo because you've taken steps to form those partnerships that will actually help you create the land bridge, which is why you guys got the Reconnecting Communities Award, because you are at a point now where you can see light at the end of the tunnel, right? With the land bridge. We're not quite there in New Orleans. We still have to work on those relationships. So I think Rondo is very significant because it's a lesson in how to organize effectively to achieve the mission. So it's good for us to learn about Rondo.
Right. And we appreciate that, of course.
Yeah.
But, there's some communities that are fighting against highway expansion, let alone getting rid of them. They're like in Houston, they're fighting against the expansion of certain highways and that community.
Right.
And I think
Portland also.
And what?
Portland also.
Yeah.
In the Rose Quarter. That's a big fight. And actually, the youth movement in Portland is very effective. They protest at the Oregon DOT, I think weekly sometimes. And they picket times.
And with youth, on the topic of youth, we are the Rondo Youth Council.
Yeah.
Why do you think youth is so important in these types of discussions?
Well, I think that you guys see the world very, very differently. You're looking forward because you want to grow up to be productive adults, right? And you can't do that in an environment or in a world that's just crippled. And right now, the world is pretty much crippled, but in America, we know we're crippled. So I think it is very inspiring to see the youth stand up and have a voice, speak what's on their minds. I really admire that because there is a group of adults who are still afraid to do that, right? So there are a large group of adults who are afraid to say what they have to say. So I cheer the youth on. Actually, a large part of the work that we do in New Orleans is education. So we work with youth beginning in first grade. We don't wait until they get to high
wow.
school and middle school. We start educating in first grade about the highway and the environment. We've taken first graders out and they've participated in lead testing in playgrounds. So we are teaching them because this is their environment and it's everyone's to protect, right? So, but you guys have a big voice and I'm very proud of you for speaking up.
I appreciate that. When you say, you have kids out there testing for lead.
Yeah.
That's a big environmental issue.
Yes.
Can you speak more on the environmental effects of highways?
Yeah. So actually the testing that I'm referring to was done in a playground that sits right beneath the highway. So in New Orleans, we had no respect for playgrounds, when the highway was built. We built through one and on top of another one, if you can imagine that. So we tested lead where the highway goes through a recreation area. And we thought that there wouldn't be a lot of lead because of Katrina and the flooding. And we have systemic flooding in Treme in places. So we thought, well, the topsoil gets washed and we won't find a lot. But that's not true. So we went to this park and we tested at a tree that was farthest away from the highway. And then we walked, closer and closer and closer. And Dr. Milky, who's known as the leadhead, I think he just retired from Tulane University, he would measure at each tree. And he found that the readings were getting worse and worse as we got close to the highway. So when we got to the tree that was closest to the highway, he looked at me and he said, "This is horrible. You have to do something about it." So I carry that with me. So we have to get rid of the highway because that's really the only way to mitigate that level of contamination, especially since we thought it had been washed away. So part of our work with the EPA that's coming up is that we are going to do some lead testing. We're going to continue to sort of uncover, what's going on, particularly in these public spaces. So in the park where the highway goes over it, and it's a twin span, so it's even worse, right? We have the lead, we have the noise, we have the poor air quality. It's not a place where children should play, but more importantly, children are smart enough to never ask to go there because you go to both of those playgrounds and you never see kids.
Wow.
Ever.
Yeah.
Right.
It's crazy.
Yes, it's very crazy.
So with removing the highway, putting in an avenue, how would this project affect Treme and the 7th?
Well, I think to begin with, we can begin to see some affordable housing development, especially in the 7th Ward, because that is what was removed. So we have a large swath of land where we can build affordable housing. So that is an opportunity. We can also build some affordable commercial spaces. So once the highway is removed, we'll regain 60 acres of developable land. That's a lot of land that can be devoted to housing and small commercial. So we need small commercial. We don't need big box footprints. First of all, architecturally, it won't fit. And we don't have the parcels that would support those kinds of large developments here. But we could build spaces that are suitable for entrepreneurs, affordable, right? Not overbuilt so that they have so much square footage that they can't maintain it. So we have a lot of opportunity with that 60 acres to actually rebuild the commercial corridor and then help to solve our housing crisis. And under the expressway, we have a homeless camp. Right now it's about 4 blocks. That's because the city goes and they sweep under and relocate people I guess, or the people relocate and then they come back. So we have a growing homeless camp under that section of the highway. So we have serious issues in New Orleans that we have to solve. And I think removal of the highway will help us address them to begin with.
Okay. So with the Claiborne Avenue project and the Rondo land bridge, some people say that it will cause gentrification.
Yes.
And that it will displace some people.
Yes.
So how do we as restorative organizations address gentrification?
Well, first of all, everybody needs to be at the table, particularly those people who are threatened with displacement. So that's one thing. The other thing is the cities, local governments have opportunities to actually create incentives to keep people in their homes or encourage businesses. So I think you have to look at your tools. The local government has tools in its toolkit, incentives, tax abatements, those kinds of things. We need to use those. I can tell you in New Orleans, we're not using them. Right. So that is one thing that we can do. But the truth about gentrification, and I don't know how it's happening in Rondo, but I can tell you in New Orleans, in Tremaine, the 7th Ward, it started happening around the year 2000. So we're 23 years into this neighborhood being gentrified, which I would argue had nothing to do with my discussion of removing the highway. Because I wasn't doing it 23 years ago. I didn't live here. I was living and practicing in Florida. So neighborhoods are gentrified because they're convenient to downtown, right? Tremaine is very walkable. You can walk to the Central Business District. You can walk to the French Quarter. You can walk to almost anything you want. We need a grocery store. We need that back. We're getting them back. But I would argue that gentrification took hold here because of a couple of things. The property was very cheap. A lot of people were displaced with Katrina. So that meant that there were lots of rental properties. This used to be a rental community primarily. My family is one of the few families that have owned for this long in this neighborhood. So a lot of the renters were displaced, and that opened up the market for investment. So there are a lot of dynamics that went on here. The TV show Tremaine that HBO had, that encouraged gentrification. A lot of folks in the movie industry, because the property was so cheap here and folks were still gone after Katrina, they came in and they bought properties. So gentrification is a very complex thing in New Orleans. And then we have short-term rentals because this is a very tourist-driven city, right? So now we have those people who were displaced with Katrina have had to move to the suburbs, and those houses, many of them became short-term rentals for tourists because the owners just held them and held them and held them. So gentrification, I think, you can't always only blame it on one thing. It's a complement of things that go into that stew, if you will. So in each city, I think it would behoove folks who are having the conversation to look at the dynamics of everything, because you can't just say, we're going to do one thing and that solves it, because it was created by many things.
That's very interesting. And after Hurricane Katrina, can you tell us more about that? The effects of Hurricane Katrina?
Yeah, I can. Actually, I was living in Florida when Hurricane Katrina hit. So I was on the front line of Katrina. It hit South Florida first.
Right, yeah.
And it was scary. It was a huge Category 5. And I was born in, hurricane zone. So I grew up with them, but that was the first time I cried when I saw the radar. It was that scary. So it came across Florida, fortunately weakened, and then came into New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina is not what devastated New Orleans. What devastated New Orleans was the failure of the levee system, which actually happened after Katrina had passed. So it wasn't the wind that did it. It wasn't the actual hurricane. It was part of the aftermath of the hurricane that actually displaced people. And many people reported hearing loud booms after it was silent, which meant that the hurricane had moved on. It was scary for me because I was very worried about my family. And fortunately they evacuated. And they evacuated because my house shakes. And I told my brother to leave because his kids would not appreciate it. And it was a good thing that they evacuated. But I was worried because nobody was on our property and the city was completely dark, very scary, a lot of police action. But also I was very worried about the flood waters. I was put at ease when I saw the roof of the house on CNN. I was very glad that they took those aerial shots and realized that the house was safe. And actually it hadn't been inundated. So we didn't get water in our house. That's one of the good things about living where I live in Treme. I live on a ridge. So New Orleans is kind of wavy, right, even though it doesn't look like that. And I live on Durbany Ridge. So I got water up to the porch, but not in the house. So that was a blessing for us because I had just left the property and gone back to Florida and left some of my dad's manuscripts. My dad was a musician. He was a classical musician. He wasn't the musician that we normally associate with New Orleans music. He was a different sort of New Orleans musician, but we had left his manuscripts in bins on the floor near his piano. And I was afraid that we had lost that, but we didn't. So it was scary on many levels. Coming back to the city, it was barren. It was spooky. People weren't on the street. It was very eerie here. And it took a while for folks to kind of move back and get settled. But there are places in New Orleans that are still suffering from Katrina. The Ninth Ward is one of them. A lot of vacant properties there still.
Yeah, I can't imagine going through a hurricane because, here in Minnesota, we get blizzards. We get tornadoes sometimes, but it doesn't even hit us. But yeah, going through a hurricane, I can't imagine that.
Yeah.
But on the topic of gentrification, how does gentrification take root in a community?
Let's take short-term rentals, for instance. So, as I said, property owners who had rental properties sat on them, and they either converted them to short-term rentals when the short-term rental market started to get hot, right? But those who wanted to sell realized that they could sell for a huge profit. So folks, I'll take the house across the street from me. At one time, it listed for $70,000 and the owner wouldn't sell. He wouldn't sell to anybody. And then the market opened up with short-term rentals and he could sell it for $200,000. So he did. And he didn't do anything. Now, in New Orleans, $200,000 is a lot of money because folks who are in the who work in the tourist and the hospitality sector, some of them earn minimum wage. They can't afford a $200,000 house. The short-term rental market exploded here. And now that $200,000 house is worth $450,000. A hospitality worker can't buy that. So the people that I grew up with who lived in that house across the street could not afford to come back to the house where they lived for years and years and years and years. So the folks who buy these properties now have cash, and they are mostly people who are moving to New Orleans because folks who are here, who are still here, if they don't own a home and they're working a minimum wage job, they can't buy a home. So gentrification is taking hold because the market is for people who can afford to make cash purchases in a lot of places, but they're liquid, right? They can get a mortgage. And we know this is a red line neighborhood still, right? So getting a mortgage here, if you don't come with a lot of cash, if you're Black, it's going to be difficult for you to get a $450,000 mortgage to move in a house that used to be a short-term rental. So the market here is really dynamic in that way. It's cooling up a bit because we are trying to curb the short-term rental market. That's what's driving gentrification now, I can tell you. So we're trying to curb it a little bit, but the property values are not dropping quickly. So folks who are coming in with cash don't look like me.
So would building more affordable housing, say with the Rondo Land Bridge and the Claiborne Avenue, would that help curb it?
Yes.
Could you explain?
That would help. That would help, especially if we have covenants on those houses, so that they stay in the hands of folks who need affordable housing. So there are things, that's what I'm saying. The cities have tools in their toolkits that they can use to actually create affordability, right? But there has to be a political will to do that. And I'm going to give you another example of folks not having political will in New Orleans. There was a huge development. It used to be a dairy. It was supposed to be all affordable housing. And then there was nothing to keep the developers from flipping the property. So they did, and it flipped to all short-term rentals. So all of those units in the middle of the city now, instead of being affordable, like the developers promised the city, flipped, and they're all short-term rentals. Now, when they flip back to, houses for homeowners, they're going to be out of reach financially. It's crazy here. So we have to build. When we say we're going to build affordable housing, we have to mean it, and we have to take action to keep it affordable. The covenants here on some affordable units are only 15 years. When I worked in Florida, they were 30 years, twice as long. We can do that.
Okay. All right. That's hopeful.
Yeah. Hopeful. You have to remain hopeful when you do this work. Definitely.
That's what we talk about on our podcast. There's hope.
Yes.
But other question is, has it ever been discussed, with, instead of having an avenue that's car centric, why not just have a walkable boulevard with less cars?
Who said it was going to be car centric? I didn't say that. I didn't say that. So as we rebuild the boulevard, it has to be multimodal. We have a lot of bikers here, believe it or not. We've had bikers in New Orleans for decades because people were too poor to afford a car, and the neighborhood is already walkable. So we have a great block structure in Treme, the 7th Ward. Our blocks are short. We don't have mega blocks. They're about 300 feet. The traffic on Claiborne moves quickly, but it can be slowed down a little bit right now. So the highway sits on top of the street, so you can still see the bones of the street. So there's a median in the center, and then on each side of the median, just 2 lanes of traffic and parking. So it's a very classic boulevard. So we're not going to open that up and make it another super highway. That would defeat the purposes, right? Right. And we want to build businesses and have them live, which means the traffic has to move relatively slowly so people can see what's going on in the shops that I know will come once we get our work going. So we already have the walkable bones. We just have to remove the ramps, which are blocking the street grid. And then back in the 7th Ward, it just created a maze. So there's a lot more work to do in terms of reestablishing the street grid in the 7th Ward. It's like I said, that's the tragic part of highway building that people don't see. So I try my best to expose it when I can. But we already have a very walkable block structure. So it's not, I mean, that's why Tremaine is being gentrified. You can walk from here to the French Quarter. So I live 18 blocks from the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River is the edge of the French Quarter. I live 6 blocks from the northern boundary of the French Quarter. I can walk to the CBD. I have access to a bus route. It used to be better. So we already have that structure built in. So New Orleans never lost its bones. The highway was just a wreck. It was the bull in the china shop. And the china never got fixed.
Right.
Still broken.
Right. So, and also, I'm thinking about this right now. There's also another parallel with Rondo.
Okay.
There's another route for Treme, right? It was supposed to go through the French Quarter instead of.
No. So here's the story.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, I have to tell you about the expressway that was supposed to go through the French Quarter. So Treme, the Claiborne Expressway, which wrecked Treme in the 7th Ward, was planned in 1945 by the city and the state. It was part of the Eisenhower highway building program. It was part of the Eisenhower dream.
Right.
The expressway that was supposed to go into the French Quarter was proposed by Robert Moses. So the city hired Robert Moses in 1946. So Treme was already a done deal. There are news articles that say, we're going to put this through Treme and it'll take suburbanites right into downtown. It'll be the best thing since sliced bread. That's published. I have that news article. In 1946, Robert Moses came and he did 2 things. He proposed the Riverfront Expressway, which was defeated, and then the Crescent City Connection, which connected the east and west banks of New Orleans. The Crescent City Connection is up and running. It's a mess, though. It's congested. But the French Quarter, the Riverfront Expressway was defeated by 2 young men, Dick Bombach and my dear friend, the late Bill Bora. They were very young men. Bill was at the London School of Economics. He came home, had a beer with his friend in the Napoleon House. They discovered that this was coming through the French Quarter, and they went into action and defeated it, got funding from the folks who own Sears and Roebuck, way back in the Wayback Machine. And that's how they defeated it. They had money to fuel their advocacy. In the meantime, the Claiborne Expressway was a done deal, right? It was already coming into existence. So even though people put the 2 stories together, they happened during the same time period, but one did not beget the other.
So pretty much there's 2 highways planned. One was going to happen regardless, and then one was just struck down.
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.
Precisely.
But that still shows that, Treme is still happening, and then French Quarter.
Yeah. The Black people in Treme, they were saying, no.
Right. They were saying the exact same thing as French Quarter, but.
Right. Yeah. But French Quarter had money.
Yeah. They
had money and they had agency because they were wealthy, young, white men. The Black activists and political leaders in Treme had no voice. Nobody listened to them. So you can see what happened.
Yeah. Some people say it's just a coincidence. Is it? Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's a coincidence.
No, I'm saying, like, is it a coincidence? I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so.
No.
But last question here, running a little bit over, but
okay.
Do you see a future where highways generally get like phased out
Yes.
Or do you think it'll stay the same and maybe in some cities they get rid of, or in,
Yeah, I think that the highway removal and anti-expansion movement is growing by leaps and bounds. I've seen it grow from a couple people in 2019, which was just a short 4 years ago, right? Even through COVID, it has grown exponentially to folks who are fighting across the nation. So there was just a handful of us who started this latest freeway fighting movement, and it's just exploded. So I think what we have to do is really continue talking to one another, understand how DOTs work, understand who the players are, support one another, be examples for one another. And I think together we can do it. I think we can change transportation. Even in Louisiana, we now have a statewide transportation reform coalition, which is unheard of here.
That's it for the interview. That's all I got. Really enjoyed this. Maybe we could do it again, but
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for your time. Yeah, learned a lot. Hopefully the people who will see this will also learn a lot. And yeah.
Sure. And one more thing before we leave, check out Allendale Strong, because I take inspiration from them. They are fighting a zombie project is what we're calling them, in Shreveport, Louisiana. So there's a fight in Shreveport. There's a fight in Lafayette. 2 fights in New Orleans. People don't know about the planned Florida Expressway for the 9th Ward. You thought Katrina did a job. This will wreck it. So there's a lot of activity going on in Louisiana alone. Louisiana, Texas, everywhere. It's bubbling.
Yeah. Yep. So thank you again for your time. Enjoy talking to you. Yeah. Check out the Claiborne Avenue Allaince.
Thank you for having me. I appreciated the conversation.
All right. Thank you.
All righty.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching our podcast. If you like what you see, give us a like, hit that subscribe button, and click that notification bell to get notified when we put out new podcast episodes.